really random question. How does like the field feel about like 23andMe and these type of like
Oh, boy.
genealogy websites?
It's bullshit.
Yeah.
It's all bullshit for like lots of reasons. One of the key reasons is like, look at it. The scale of your ancestry is so, you have what? Half of the DNA of your parents, a quarter of your grandparents, an eighth of your great-grandparents, so on and so forth. Once you go back like 15 generations, you actually are missing the vast majority of the DNA signatures from each of your ancestors, if you see what I mean. And so they can't reconstruct that. It's actually, the human isopoint. So the isopoint is where you can tell that everybody in a population shares the same ancestors. You might have different inputs from different ancestors statistically, but everybody shares the exact same ancestors. So for Europeans, the isopoint is about 1,000 years ago, which means that every single person alive 1,000 years ago in Europe that has passed on DNA to today, every European has those exact same ancestors. The human isopoint for all of humanity is just a few thousand years ago. And so we all share the same ancestry. We are actually extremely closely related. And so these kind of DNA tests, they tell this very interesting fiction, if you see what I mean, that ignores all the diversity and interrelatedness because of all of our ancestral intermingling that has happened. And the other issue that I find with this kind of studies is they mostly take account of modern DNA. So what it is actually telling you is your DNA statistically is similar to modern people in Ireland, not necessarily similar to ancient people in Ireland. If you
That's
see
what I was
mean.
going to say, because I was going to say, and I'd have to read them more particularly because I've never done one of these before. But I don't know if I would say that it's bullshit or they're bad. It's just understanding like it's understanding what exactly they're telling you, which is all they're doing when they do these things. I feel like they say it on, but maybe they don't. All they're doing when they do these things is your DNA, based on the sample that we did, seems like it matches people that are also testing from like this area.
Exactly.
And that's it. That's the
But
extent.
people interpret that as
2 million years
something
ago,
else,
my Irish ancestor.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And when in fact that's not the friggin' case at all, because if you look at the archaeology of Ireland, you can see changes in population structure over time. The Irish population was not the same, if you see what I mean. There's new people coming, there's other people dying, there's who chooses to reproduce and leave, there's all this kind of stuff that goes in there. And the reality, the history of humanity is one of just intermingling in the end.
Yeah, I think from just from a mere interest perspective, I did an ancestry thing a little while ago because I was curious because I know my dad's ancestry very well, but my mom was adopted and we don't know very much about where her parents were from. So I was like, okay, I'll be able to I know what my dad is, so I can look at the other half and at least figure out where her parents were from. So I know my dad is fully Italian, so I was like, whatever the other 50% is will probably be that. Well, it turns out I'm 80% Italian, so I was like, okay, that's pretty safe to assume one of her parents was probably also fully Italian, and there's a little bit of Greek, a little bit of Polish, a little bit of something else sprinkled in there. But that was kind of interesting to be able to get that. And then, extrapolating that out to kind of what you're talking about, that is modern, semi-modern Italian, people who live there now. Probably a very small part of that data or that DNA goes back to Romans, because Italy was people came into it after the collapse of the Roman Empire. There was Germanic speaking people that came in and people came from Greece and this and that and the other. So my DNA lines up very well with modern populations in central southern Italy. And that is probably where for the last 300-400 years my ancestors were, but that doesn't mean that my ancestors were Roman gladiators or something as cool as that would be. So
I do politics here. Hold on, so because I can't let you get away with that because you showed us your 23andMe yesterday. That 50% we saw was 100 miles off the west coast of the United States actually for so much of it. It's interesting that now you're denying your Atlantean heritage. But
I'm falsifying the evidence here, man. Sure. I'm a scientist. That's what I do.
So if you take a 23andMe and it says you're 80% from France or anything like that, it's probably reasonable to assume that the last 4 generations of you probably immigrated from France or was from France, but it's probably not much deeper than 70 to 80 years back in your family history or 120 years. It's not going much deeper than that, if that.
And there's obviously confusing signatures there as well because not everybody in France has the same DNA, right? And so it's sort of what it means is you're 80% similar to people in France today. But potentially it's the case where your ancestor actually came from Italy, but they had similar DNA to somebody from France, if you see what I mean. And so, because that's the kind of stuff that it can't detect, is it's homogenizing what is actually a fairly heterogeneous group. You know, it's sort of saying this is French DNA, but of course, people living in Italy or Russia had some French DNA. They're just the exception to the rule in that area, if you see what I mean. And so that's where it becomes tricky.
Right, it's comparing you to an aggregate, essentially.
And so it just means you are similar, closely related to people in France now, on average, who's in France now. Yeah.
Gotcha.